Here is something that should genuinely unsettle you. Right now, in the canned goods aisle of your regular grocery store, 15 specific products are in the early stages of a disappearance that most shoppers will not notice until the shelves are bare and the prices have doubled. These are not the exotic items. Several of them are things you have walked past hundreds of times without a second thought. By the time the mainstream conversation catches up to what is already happening in supply chains, distribution networks, and fishing quotas around the world, the window to act will have quietly closed. Let's go through all 15. And stay with this until the end, because number 1 has a supply story behind it that genuinely changes how you look at that section of the grocery store forever. Canned refried beans. This one feels almost too ordinary to mention. Refried beans have been on American grocery shelves so consistently for so long that most people treat them as permanent. A fixture. The kind of thing that will always be there, always cost under $2, always stacked neatly at the end of the aisle. That assumption is exactly what makes this disappearance so easy to miss. Here is what is actually happening. Pinto beans, the primary ingredient in nearly all commercially produced refried beans, are grown in a surprisingly concentrated set of regions. North Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, and parts of the American Southwest account for the overwhelming majority of domestic production. Several of those regions have experienced back-to-back growing seasons under significant drought stress. Yield reductions have been documented across multiple consecutive years, and there is no meaningful short-term relief in the forecast for water availability in the most affected areas. But the crop pressure is only the first layer. The second is the can itself. Steel and aluminum costs have risen substantially over the past 3 years. For a low-margin product like refried beans, that packaging cost increase does not get absorbed quietly. Manufacturers respond in predictable ways. They reduce production runs. They prioritize higher-margin products. They shrink the can size while holding the price. All 3 of those responses are already visible on shelves right now if you know what to look for. Refried beans are one of the most efficient comfort foods in any pantry. They work as a protein source, a meal base, a dip, a burrito filling, and a soup thickener. Losing reliable access to them is a bigger deal than most people calculate until they actually try to build meals without them. Canned clams. Most people have never bought a can of clams on purpose. They ended up in a cart for a clam chowder someone planned to make once, and then became the can that sits in the back of the cabinet for 18 months. That is a genuinely unfortunate relationship with one of the most nutritionally dense and shelf-stable protein sources available in a standard grocery store. Here is why that relationship is about to change involuntarily. Commercial clam harvesting operates under quota systems tied directly to population health assessments. Those assessments, conducted across multiple major harvesting regions along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, have been returning declining numbers for several consecutive seasons. The reasons are familiar by now if you have been paying attention to the broader seafood supply picture. Ocean temperature increases are shifting the spawning patterns and migration behavior of bivalves in ways that do not favor commercial harvest. Specific bacterial contamination events tied to warmer coastal waters have triggered extended closures in traditionally productive areas. Supply shrinks. Shelves follow fast, and canned clams operate in a niche enough market that when supply contracts, processors do not scramble to fill the gap. They simply move capacity elsewhere. One can of clams delivers around 20 grams of protein and is one of the highest dietary sources of vitamin B12 available in shelf-stable form. B12 deficiency, which develops over months rather than years, affects neurological function, energy metabolism, and red blood cell production. In a scenario where meat and fresh seafood are unavailable for extended periods, that matters considerably more than the clam chowder you were vaguely planning to make someday. Canned pumpkin. This is the one that makes people laugh first, and then go quiet when they hear the actual numbers. Here's the statistic. A single company, Libby's, which operates under the Nestlé umbrella, produces approximately 85% of the world's canned pumpkin supply. Not approximately, not roughly. 85% of global production comes from one company's operations, centered around one processing facility in Morton, Illinois. Morton, Illinois, by the way, calls itself the pumpkin capital of the world, which is charming until you realize it means the entire canned pumpkin supply chain runs through one Midwestern town. That is a supply chain so concentrated it would be alarming in any product category. In food, it is extraordinary. The variety of pumpkin used in canning, the Dickinson squash, is not the orange globe you carve in October. It is a tan, oblong variety that grows in specific conditions and does not transfer easily to other agricultural regions. Disease pressure on squash crops, particularly certain strains of powdery mildew and vine borers that have expanded their range alongside warming temperatures, has created genuine yield instability in recent seasons. One facility, zero backup, gone. There is no second facility ramping up to cover the gap. The shelves go empty in October, which happened in 2020 and 2021, and the jokes circulated on social media. It is going to stop being funny. Canned pumpkin is one of the most versatile high-fiber pantry ingredients available. It works in soups, sauces, baked goods, and as a standalone side. Stock it before the conversation stops being amusing. Canned coconut milk. Pay attention to this one, because it connects to a nutritional gap in emergency food planning that almost nobody addresses directly. Virtually all canned coconut milk consumed in the United States is imported. Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia together account for the overwhelming majority of global coconut milk production. That is a supply chain that crosses the Pacific, passes through port systems under increasing congestion pressure, and operates within agricultural regions that are directly exposed to the kinds of weather disruptions, political instability, and labor cost increases that have been driving supply volatility across Southeast Asian agricultural exports for the past several years. But the supply story is only the entry point. The real reason canned coconut milk belongs near the top of this list is what it does nutritionally that almost nothing else in the canned goods aisle can replicate. A standard 14-ounce can of full-fat coconut milk contains roughly 450 calories, almost entirely from fat. That sounds like a warning label. It is actually the point. Dietary fat is not optional. It is biologically required for vitamin absorption, hormone production, and sustained energy. Most shelf-stable pantry staples, rice, beans, canned vegetables, provide almost none. Coconut milk fills that gap with a single can, and it does it while also adding genuine flavor and richness to rice dishes, curries, soups, and oatmeal in a way that makes eating the same 5 ingredients repeatedly dramatically more tolerable. The fat in coconut milk is predominantly saturated, which means it is stable at room temperature and resists rancidity far longer than most liquid cooking fats. This is not a niche product. This is a strategic pantry anchor that is getting harder to find at a reasonable price every quarter. Canned green chilies. Here is where the geographic concentration story gets almost absurdly specific. The Hatch Valley of New Mexico produces the chili peppers used in the vast majority of commercially canned green chilies sold across the United States. Not most, the vast majority. And the Hatch Valley sits in a region currently facing a water availability situation that agricultural extension services in New Mexico have been describing with increasingly direct language for the past several years. The Rio Grande, which provides a critical portion of irrigation water for the region, has been running at reduced levels driven by prolonged drought conditions and upstream demand increases that are not easing. When water is restricted, acreage gets pulled. When acreage gets pulled in a region with essentially no domestic backup, supply falls and it does not recover quickly. Chili crops take years of established growing relationships and specific soil conditions to replicate elsewhere. You cannot simply shift hatch chili production to Iowa and call it the same product. The terroir matters, and more practically, the infrastructure does not exist anywhere else. $2 transforms everything else. A 4-ounce can of diced green chilies transforms scrambled eggs, rice dishes, bean soups, canned chicken, and quesadillas in ways that are disproportionate to both the size and the cost of the product. In the context of a long-term food reserve where monotony is the enemy, this is the kind of ingredient that makes everything around it more sustainable to eat. Stock it aggressively while it is still easy to find and still cheap. Canned crab meat. There was a time, not that long ago, when a can of blue crab or Dungeness crab was a reasonable grocery store purchase that did not require a special occasion or a significant budget reallocation. That time is ending faster than most people realize. Both the Dungeness crab fishery along the Pacific coast and the blue crab fishery in the Chesapeake Bay and broader Atlantic region have experienced documented population declines driven by combinations of overharvesting, habitat degradation, and the same ocean temperature shifts affecting commercial shellfish populations broadly. Dungeness crab seasons have been shortened by regulatory action in multiple recent years. The blue crab situation in the Chesapeake, which has historically been one of the most productive crab fisheries in the world, has been described by Maryland fisheries managers in terms that should be taken seriously. Populations drop. Economics collapse fast. Processors cut production. Prices rise. The retail product that once sat affordably on a grocery shelf migrates to specialty stores at specialty prices and eventually stops appearing in the canned goods aisle altogether. That trajectory is already underway. Canned crab meat is not gone yet, but the trend line is not subtle. From a nutrition standpoint, canned crab delivers high-quality, complete protein and meaningful zinc concentrations at a caloric density that works well in a lean pantry. More than that, it is one of the few shelf-stable proteins that genuinely feels like an indulgence. And that matters, which will come up again before this list is finished. Canned artichoke hearts. Most people either love artichokes or have never tried them because they look vaguely intimidating at the grocery store. If you fall into the second camp, the canned version removes all of that friction and delivers a genuinely versatile pantry ingredient that is quietly becoming harder to source reliably. Here's why. California produces nearly 100% of commercially grown artichokes in the United States. One state, and not just any part of California, the coastal growing regions around Castroville, which calls itself the artichoke capital of the world with slightly more justification than Morton. Illinois claims for pumpkin provide the specific cool, foggy coastal climate that artichokes require. That region is under the same water allocation pressures affecting California agriculture broadly, and the artichokes are a water-intensive perennial crop that does not respond well to irrigation cuts. When growing conditions tighten in the only domestic production region, there is no fallback. Imports exist, but they face the same quality control, tariff, and logistics pressures affecting most agricultural imports right now. For the pantry, canned artichoke hearts are one of those ingredients that earns its place through sheer versatility. Add them to pasta, grain bowls, dips, sandwiches, and soups. They hold texture well in cooking applications. They provide fiber, folate, and antioxidants in a form that stays shelf-stable for years. Most importantly, they are interesting. In a long stretch of repetitive meals, interesting matters more than any nutritional label. Canned beef stew. Every cost up. Margins gone. Which is not a less serious story. It is just a different one. Beef prices have risen substantially and have not meaningfully retreated. Manufacturing costs are up. Energy costs for processing facilities are up. Labor costs are up. transportation costs are up. For a product like canned beef stew, which sells at a relatively low price point to a price-sensitive consumer base and has always operated on thin margins, the math at some point stops working for manufacturers. The response, already visible across the category, takes several forms. Shrinkflation reduces the can size while holding the price, so you are getting less stew for the same dollar. Reformulation quietly reduces the beef content and increases the cheaper filler ingredients, potatoes, broth, starch. And in some cases, the product line gets discontinued entirely because the margin profile no longer justifies the shelf space. Ready-to-eat canned meals, the kind that require nothing beyond a can opener and a bowl, represent a category of emergency nutrition that is genuinely hard to replace from individual ingredients when you are managing a disrupted household. The convenience is the point. The fact that canned beef stew is getting worse, smaller, and rarer simultaneously is not a minor trend. It is a signal that this particular type of shelf-stable convenience meal is moving toward the exit. Stock the versions you trust before reformulation makes the decision for you. Canned oysters. Canned oysters are the dark horse of this entire list. Most people skip past them, and I get it, they have a reputation. The can looks a little ominous. You are not entirely sure what you would do with them. But stay here for a minute, because the nutrition case for canned oysters is one of the most compelling on any shelf in the grocery store, and the supply story behind their disappearance is one of the most concerning. Oyster populations in virtually every major harvesting region are under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Ocean acidification, driven by increased atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolving into seawater, directly impairs the ability of oyster larvae to form shells. This is not a projected future risk. It is a documented current phenomenon affecting hatcheries and wild populations along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts right now. Warmer water temperatures have expanded the range of oyster diseases and parasites. Wild harvest has declined sharply enough that commercial production has shifted significantly toward aquaculture, and aquaculture operations face their own input cost and environmental challenge pressures when wild populations decline and aquaculture struggles to scale fast enough to cover the gap. Canned product supply tightens, and a niche product category like canned oysters does not attract the kind of aggressive sourcing attention that tuna or salmon would. Here is why that matters nutritionally. A single can of smoked oysters delivers exceptional concentrations of zinc, which is one of the most critical immune-supporting minerals and one of the most commonly deficient in emergency food scenarios. They also provide iron, selenium, vitamin B12, and complete protein in a calorie-dense package. There's almost nothing else on the shelf that covers that specific nutritional ground in shelf-stable form. When canned oysters are gone from mid-level grocery chains, they are gone. Canned evaporated goat milk. This is the most niche item on the list, which is exactly why it needs to be said loudly before the people who need it most discover the problem too late. For households. With members who are lactose sensitive, dairy allergic, or managing certain digestive conditions, evaporated goat milk is not a preference. It is a functional necessity. Goat milk contains a different protein structure than cow's milk and a significantly lower lactose content, making it tolerable for a substantial portion of the population that cannot use standard dairy products. The domestic production of shelf-stable canned goat milk is conducted by an extraordinarily small number of processors. We are not talking about a concentrated supply chain. We are talking about a supply chain that can be counted on one hand with fingers left over. When one of those processors experiences a production disruption, which has happened in the past 18 months, the retail impact is immediate and widespread. Simultaneously, demand has been climbing. Growing awareness of dairy sensitivity and increasing interest in alternative dairy sources has pushed more consumers toward goat milk products at exactly the moment when supply is least equipped to absorb that demand increase. If this applies to your household, the window for building a meaningful reserve is narrowing faster than almost any other category on this list. Canned evaporated goat milk stores well in cool, dry conditions for multiple years. The serving size is concentrated and efficient. For the households that need it, there is genuinely no adequate substitute available in shelf-stable form. That combination of limited supply, growing demand, and irreplaceability makes this the most urgent item on this list for the specific population it serves. Canned Vienna sausages. Okay, I know, I can hear you already. Vienna sausages. The little cylinders in the pull tab can that belong in a gas station snack display next to beef jerky from 2 years ago. Bear with me, because this one earns its place. Here's the thing about Vienna sausages that preparedness planning consistently underestimates. They are one of the few shelf-stable, ready-to-eat protein sources that require absolutely nothing. No heat, no water, no preparation of any kind. Open the can, eat. For a household managing a multi-day power outage or a disrupted supply situation, that zero-friction protein access has practical value that goes well beyond what the product's humble reputation suggests. The supply story is real. Pork input costs have risen significantly following consecutive years of feed cost increases, processing facility capacity constraints, and labor challenges at the plant level. Vienna sausages operate at the low-margin end of the processed meat category, which means they absorb input cost increases poorly. Several regional brands have already quietly exited the category. The remaining producers have raised prices and in some cases reduced the can size. The trajectory follows the same pattern as canned beef stew. Worse product, higher price, eventual discontinuation. There is also a psychological dimension here worth taking seriously. Research on morale during extended food restriction consistently identifies familiar, comfort-associated foods as one of the most effective tools for maintaining household stability under stress. Vienna sausages are not a gourmet experience, but they taste like something you have eaten before, on normal days, in normal circumstances. In a situation where very few things feel normal, that familiarity carries genuine functional weight. Canned jackfruit. Here is one that will not be on most people's radar, which is either a reason to skip it or a reason to pay closer attention, depending on how you think about these things. Jackfruit is the largest tree-borne fruit in the world. Young green jackfruit, canned before it ripens, has a fibrous texture that so closely mimics pulled pork or shredded chicken in cooking applications that it has become one of the most widely used meat alternatives in both vegetarian cooking and mainstream recipe development over the past several years. It absorbs flavors aggressively, holds up to long cooking times, and provides a genuinely satisfying texture in tacos, sandwiches, grain bowls, and curries. The problem is that jackfruit is grown almost exclusively in South and Southeast Asia. India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Thailand together account for essentially all commercial production. That means every can of jackfruit on an American grocery shelf crossed an ocean to get there, passed through a port system that has demonstrated real vulnerability to congestion and disruption, and navigated a tariff environment that has been shifting unpredictably. When import-dependent specialty foods hit supply pressure, mid-tier grocery chains are the first to lose the product. The specialty stores hold on longer because their customer base absorbs price, increases more readily. But by the time jackfruit has migrated entirely out of regular grocery stores and into specialty retail at elevated prices, the window for building a practical pantry reserve at a reasonable cost has closed. Nutritionally, canned jackfruit provides fiber, potassium, and a small amount of plant-based protein. Its real pantry value is culinary. It makes meals feel more substantial and varied at a point in any extended disruption where that quality becomes surprisingly important. Canned anchovies. Most people own exactly 0 cans of anchovies right now. Most people are also not aware that removing them from their pantry consideration is quietly costing them one of the most potent flavor and nutrition tools available in canned form. And this is the part where I acknowledge that yes, anchovies are polarizing, and no, I am not going to apologize for putting them this high on the list. Here is the supply picture. Anchovy fishing is concentrated primarily in the South American Pacific fishery, particularly off the coasts of Peru and Chile, and in Mediterranean waters. The Peruvian anchovy fishery is one of the largest by volume in the world, but it is also one of the most volatile, directly tied to the El Niño and La Niña ocean temperature cycles that shift anchovy populations dramatically from year to year. Recent seasons have seen quota cuts that exceed even the sardine situation in other parts of the seafood supply picture. The Mediterranean fishery faces its own separate pressures from warming sea temperatures and regulatory tightening across the European Union. The result is a global anchovy supply that is shrinking in ways that are not temporary. This is structural. And because anchovies represent a niche retail category in the United States, they will disappear quietly from standard grocery shelves without generating the kind of public attention that a more mainstream product would. Here is what actually justifies putting canned anchovies at number 3. A single 2-ounce tin contains more omega-3 fatty acids per serving than most fish oil supplements and provides complete protein, calcium, and iron in a form that is stable at room temperature for 3 to 5 years. When used in cooking, a small number of anchovies dissolved into olive oil or a sauce creates a savory depth that is nearly impossible to replicate from other shelf-stable ingredients. It is not a fishy flavor. It is umami. It is the background note that makes everything around it taste more like a real meal. 2 tins per month rotated through a pantry dramatically changes the cooking experience of every other staple on the shelf. Canned San Marzano tomatoes. Here's where the story gets more complicated, because this one involves not just a genuine supply problem, but a counterfeiting epidemic happening in plain sight on American grocery store shelves. San Marzano tomatoes carry a Denominazione di Origine Protetta designation, which is the Italian certification that restricts authentic production to a specific zone in the Campania region near Naples. The volcanic soil, the specific microclimate of the Sarno River Valley, and the particular growing conditions of that region produce a tomato variety that is genuinely distinct. Lower acidity, denser flesh, more complex flavor. It is not marketing language. The difference in a side-by-side comparison is real. The Campania region has experienced significant crop pressure in recent seasons. Irregular rainfall patterns, heat events during critical growing windows, and increasing disease pressure have reduced authentic yield in ways that have tightened genuine supply. At the same time, demand for San Marzano tomatoes in the American market has continued growing. What fills the gap when authentic supply shrinks and demand rises? Labels. A substantial percentage of canned tomatoes currently being sold in the United States bearing San Marzano designations are not authentic DOP certified product. Italian authorities and independent testing have confirmed this repeatedly. You are paying a premium for something that is increasingly a label rather than a product. As authentic supply continues to tighten, the real thing becomes rarer and more expensive. At the same time, the imitation market expands. For a pantry built around quality ingredients that genuinely perform in cooking, this matters. Whole San Marzano tomatoes are one of the most functional canned goods in existence. They anchor pasta sauces, braises, soups, and stews with an acidity and depth that standard canned tomatoes cannot match. Stock the authenticated product now, while it is still findable at a price that makes sense. Canned wild Alaskan salmon. This is the one that ties every thread together, and it is the one that has the most serious, most documented, and most irreversible supply story of anything on this list. Wild Alaskan salmon runs have been declining. That sentence has been true in a general sense for decades, but the scale of what has happened in specific fisheries over the past 3 years represents a meaningful escalation beyond historical fluctuation. The Yukon River Chinook salmon run has been so severely reduced that the federal government declared a fishery disaster. Commercial salmon seasons along multiple sections of the Alaskan coast have been shortened, restricted, or in some cases closed entirely, not as a precaution, but as a direct response to population assessment data showing runs well below sustainable harvest thresholds. The ocean temperature shifts driving these declines affect salmon at every life stage. Warmer water reduces the prey fish populations that juvenile salmon depend on for their first ocean years. It alters migration patterns and the timing of runs. It increases marine mortality before fish ever return to spawn. These are not conditions that reverse on any timeline that is useful for pantry planning, and there is an additional market pressure that most American consumers have not factored in. Asian export markets, particularly Japan, South Korea, and China, have significantly increased their demand for wild Alaskan salmon product. When global demand for a shrinking supply increases, prices rise and the lower-margin domestic retail channel gets squeezed. Canneries along the Alaskan coast have been closing. The ones still operating are facing input and labor cost increases that are pushing retail prices toward a level where canned wild salmon stops functioning as an everyday grocery item and becomes something else entirely. This matters nutritionally in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Canned wild Alaskan salmon delivers omega-3 fatty acid concentrations that rival fresh salmon. It provides complete protein, vitamin D, and, because the small bones are included and softened by the canning process, a significant calcium source in a completely shelf-stable form with no refrigeration required. It covers nutritional gaps that almost nothing else on the shelf can address simultaneously. 2 or 3 cans per week in a normal rotation becomes a reasonable insurance policy for a household that understands what it is insuring against. The price of building that reserve today is a fraction of what it will cost when the supply trend that is already underway finishes the job. Here's what ties all 15 of these together. Every single item on this list follows the same quiet pattern. Supply concentrated in one place, costs rising at every level, global competition for a shrinking product, and a retail gap that opens slowly enough that most people never see it coming until it is already here. None of these items are rice. None of them are beans. They are the things that make rice and beans survivable for more than 4 days in a row. The fat, the protein, the flavor, the familiarity. That is what disappears first and gets replaced last. 2 items per trip. 3 trips, that is the whole plan. The people positioned best 6 months from now are not going to be the ones who panicked when the shelves went bare. They are going to be the ones who moved quietly, early, and without drama. That window is right now.